folks who folks who are joining us this evening. Thank you. We will hold for about a minute or so to let folks join, and then we will go ahead and get started. We want to be sensitive of your time, and we only have an hour and a lot of information to cover. So we'll wait about a minute, and then we're gonna get going. All right. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. This is a webinar on our voting rights at stake, understanding the Save America and MAGA Acts. My name is Amy Weidstrom. I'm the executive director of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania. I want to start just by welcoming everybody, and I will orient you to what's going to happen for this evening, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So I know that there is a lot going on in the news, and I know that it can feel a little overwhelming and uncertain about what's happening. And while Iran and DHS funding um, sort of compete for headlines, the Save America Act was called out by name in the State of the Union recently. And the president wants something related to documentary proof of citizenship passed, along with a host of other restrictive voting measures. And so we really wanted to make sure that everybody has information about the sort of legal parameters of what's on the table, what this means for our communities, and then what can be done about it. Very briefly, I want to say that we are all coming from nonpartisan organizations. We are not speaking on behalf of or in favor of any party or any politician. This just means that we are here to provide good, nonpartisan, objective, and trusted information. And we just want folks to know what's going on and know how to act on it. So we are all nonpartisan organizations here in that spirit. Logistically, this is being recorded. If you'd like some captions, you can go up to your or down to your more three little buttons and get closed captions if you'd like. We are using the Q&A function only this evening, so please, if you have a question, use the Q&A function. And then we will be sending out a recording and links and resources to everyone who registered for this webinar. So you will be getting a whole host of follow-up information after this. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce our panelists today. And first, I want to thank them for joining us. We've got this evening Nicole Hansen. Nicole is a policy counsel at the Campaign Legal Center, where she provides analysis on federal election policy and emerging anti-voter threats, and works to advance laws that protect the freedom to vote and strengthen democratic participation nationwide. She previously served as elections counsel in the U.S. House for the Committee on House Administration, advising members of Congress on voting rights and fighting efforts to restrict ballot access. Jonathan Diaz is a director of voting advocacy and partnerships at the Campaign Legal Center in Washington, D.C., where he is part of the voting rights team and has been since 2018. Jonathan leads CLC's advocacy efforts on laws and policies that protect and expand the freedom to vote and their work on combating election sabotage. He also coordinates CLC's work with national, state, and local democracy partners. And finally, we have Kadita Kenner with us this evening. Kadita is a tireless advocate for social and economic justice. She is the founding CEO of both the New Pennsylvania Project Education Fund and the New Pennsylvania Project. Her driving motivation is to empower the electorate to enthusiastically participate in every election, casting their votes all the way down the entire ballot. Kadita has spearheaded initiatives to prevent the passage of judicial gerrymandering constitutional amendment, advocates for higher minimum wage, secure fair funding for public education, and protect both federal and state courts from problematic judicial nominees and extremist efforts to undermine judicial independence. Before her career in issue advocacy, Cadito worked as a director, producer, and writer for HBCU sports television programming, creating both live and scripted content in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia. She's a graduate of Temple University and lives in Chester County, the now made famous by Senator McCormick, Chester County on the floor of the Senate, and draws inspiration from civil rights organizing icon and Westchester, Pennsylvania native Bayard Rustin, one of her civil rights heroes. So thank you all for joining us. We're going to get started with Nicole and Jonathan.
Thanks so much for having us, and thank you everyone for spending your evening learning about these bills. I will start by going over what's in the Save America and Mega Acts, and then I will pass it to Jonathan to talk about kind of the state of play, where we go next. Um, I am going to largely talk about the two bills together because they do a lot of similar things. And they're both kind of part of the same project to create proof of citizenship and voter ID requirements nationwide. For the first thing that both bills do is they create extreme documentary proof of citizenship requirements for voter registration in federal elections. That means that when an individual goes to register to vote in a federal election, they will need to show some sort of document that proves their citizenship. Um, there are a variety of documents that are often complicated for a lot of folks to get. A driver's ID, driver's license alone would not be enough, including real ID. Almost every driver's license in the United States, including a Pennsylvania driver's license, doesn't actually indicate whether you're a US citizen, even if it's real ID. Instead, most voters would have to use either a passport or their driver's license or other photo ID plus another citizenship document to become registered to vote. This might be something like a certified birth certificate, naturalization papers, an adoption certificate, another document like that proves U.S. citizenship. I will note that there's a little bit of a change since the SAVE Act that we saw last summer. There was a lot of conversation about the barriers for people who've changed their name. There's a little bit of a fix for that in the new SAVE Act. An individual can sign an affidavit saying that the name on their citizenship document is a name that they previously had, but we do still remain concerned that there would be issues with implementation and, still potential for confusion and disenfranchisement for people who've changed their names. The second thing that both bills do, and this is something that's new from the SAVE Act that we saw last summer, is they impose an extreme voter ID requirement, both for voting in person and for casting a ballot by mail. I want to point out this is a strict voter ID requirement. There's no alternative for individuals who don't have ID to sign an affidavit. You provide an ID or you don't get to cast your ballot. The one exception is if individuals have a religious exemption to being photographed. But by and large, people will have to show photo ID to cast a ballot in person or by mail. And I want to point out it excludes types of IDs that are often allowed under other state voter ID laws. So you would have to use something like a driver's license. Student IDs aren't allowed. For tribal ID, there would have to be an expiration date on it, and often tribal ID doesn't have an expiration date. So many forms of ID that are allowed under other state voter ID laws are not allowed under the Save America and Mega Acts. The next thing that it would do is both bills would force frequent voter purges. State and local officials would be required to, on an ongoing basis, compare their voter lists to things like the DHS's SAVE database, state motor vehicle databases, other databases that contain citizenship information. But the problem with this is that we know that the type of information in these databases is often faulty, it's outdated. So the SAVE Act would mandate frequent voter purges, but it would be the voter purges would be based on faulty and outdated data. So we have a lot of concerns that they would result in eligible U.S. citizens being removed from the voter rolls. The next thing both bills do is mandate data sharing with DHS. Under the Save America and MEGA Acts, every state would be required to turn over their full voter registration lists to DHS. Um, that includes things like people's party affiliation, if that's on the voter registration lists, potentially includes things like where someone registered to vote, if it was at a public assistance agency. And importantly, once DHS has that data, there are no protections in the SAVE Act on what DHS could use the data for.
And Nicole, before you continue, I just want to kind of put a point on that. That is very different from the current state of what the law is. I think, as folks know, DOJ and DHS have been trying to get the full unredacted voter file from all of the states for about a year now. The Department of Justice has filed lawsuits against 29 states and DC that have refused to turn over their full unredacted voter files, most of them citing reasons like voter privacy or state laws that restrict their ability to share that kind of sensitive data with anyone, including the federal government. These provisions of the Save America Act and the MEGA Act are, I think, a direct response to states protecting their voters' information by refusing to turn that information over to the federal government at this time.
Thanks, Jonathan. Important point. So the next thing both bills do is they essentially end mail voter registration and they would upend online registration systems and voter registration drives. So the way that the bills do this is by requiring mail voter registration applicants who submit their voter registration forms by mail to go in person to the elections office to show an election official their proof of citizenship. And they have to do this by close of registration. So essentially, if someone mails their voter registration application, it's received on the voter registration deadline. Likely that person would still have to somehow make it into the voter registration office before the voter registration deadline in order to become registered to vote. And there's no sort of cure provision for applicants who submit their voter registration application. It arrives by the registration deadline to then go and show their their proof of citizenship in person after the voter registration deadline. This would also impact voter registration drives that are conducted using mail voter registration forms. I know that that's a really important and popular way that a lot of folks run their voter registration drives. Anyone that you register at a voter registration drive using a mail form would still have to go in person to the elections office to show their proof of citizenship by the voter registration deadline. It would also force states to change their online voter registration systems to be able to accept proof of citizenship. It's unclear whether a photograph or a copy of proof of citizenship would even be sufficient under the SAVE Act. That's a piece that's kind of left open.
And of course, none of these bills provide states or local governments with any funding to make any of these changes, to hire more staff, to process in-person, proof of citizenship presentations, or to completely overhaul their online registration systems.
Right. And to Jonathan's point, they also would take effect immediately when they pass. So states would somehow have to immediately be able to accept proof of citizenship, have election workers trained on proof of citizenship requirements. That would be quite a massive to do, especially right now when we're in the midst of election season. The last thing that both bills do is attack election workers. They could impose severe criminal penalties on election workers for registering an applicant to vote who doesn't provide documentary proof of citizenship. And this would be the case even if that person were a US citizen. And I want to really highlight this because there's a provision in the proof of citizenship requirement that would allow for individuals to provide some alternative form of proof of citizenship if they don't have something like a passport or a birth certificate. And when you put those two provisions together, an individual being able to provide some other form of proof of citizenship plus this criminal penalty for election workers, there's a really massive opportunity for election workers to be targeted, to be attacked, to be subject to prison time up to 5 years and serious fines. So this is, it really puts election workers in jeopardy. Not only would it subject them to potential criminal penalties, but private citizens would also be empowered to sue election workers for the same thing if they register folks without proof of citizenship. Moving on to the next slide. So the MEGA Act has a couple of additional little nuggets in it that aren't in the Save America Act. It would ban states from counting ballots that they receive after Election Day, even if those ballots are postmarked postmarked by Election Day, but then received after close of polls on Election Day. I think this would probably not be a change in Pennsylvania. But nationwide, a lot of states count ballots that are postmarked by Election Day received after. So it would massively upend a lot of election systems. And again, something that the president tried to do in the executive order and that has been blocked. It also ends permanent universal mail voting. An individual would have to submit a mail ballot request in every election in which they wish to vote by mail. And finally, it bans ranked choice voting in federal elections.
I will note, Nicole, that you are correct that Pennsylvania does not count ballots received after 8 p.m. on Election Day. So this particular part of the MEGA Act wouldn't affect the way we count ballots in Pennsylvania.
Thank you. I looked it up before the presentation, but I wanted to make sure I was right on that, so I appreciate that. So what would be the impact of this bill? About 20 million Americans, or 9% of voting age citizens, don't have proof of citizenship readily available, and 3.8 million don't have it at all. So it would create massive problems for those folks when they're trying to register to vote. As I mentioned earlier, most Real ID driver's licenses don't meet the SAVE Act's requirements. Pennsylvania's do not. And only about half of Americans have a passport, and to get a passport, it costs $165. The bill would disproportionately burden certain voters of color, working class voters, unhoused voters who might not have access to their documents, elderly voters who move around a lot, tribal citizens who can't use tribal ID without additional documentation, people born in the U.S. territories who are U.S. citizens at birth, because the way that the citizenship document provision is written, it excludes some birth certificates from the territories. And I want to point out it would affect voters, not just new voters, not just people who have never voted before, but also people who have to change their registration because they move, because they want to change their party affiliation. So a lot of folks that it would impact. I see a comment in the chat about women who've changed their names on marriage. I do want to clarify, in the Save America Act and the MEGA Act, there would still be a different impact for people who have changed their names because they got married. It is a little bit different than the SAVE Act from this past summer, where there was really no process, no clear process for people who have changed their names since they got married. Um, under the Save America Act, if someone has changed their name after they got married and therefore their driver's license doesn't match their birth certificate, they can sign an affidavit saying that the name on their birth certificate is a name that they previously had. So the burden would be less substantial than under the Save Act of this past summer. But certainly there's still a lot of there would need to be a lot of training, certainly some issues with implementation, but do want to clarify that one point. Next slide, please. And then finally, who would the other provisions impact? We would expect eligible voters to be likely purged under the voter purge provisions. There is no clear remedy for those voters if they are purged, especially if they're purged after the voter registration deadline. So someone might be purged. They might go in person to vote. If their state doesn't have same-day voter registration, they would be out of luck. Naturalized citizens would be the people most impacted likely under these voter purges, because these databases that we talked about often mark a naturalized citizen who was previously not a U.S. citizen and access services as a non-U.S. citizen and are frequently not updated. The voter ID requirement would be more extreme than almost any other state voter ID law. It would particularly impact students who can't use student ID, and also most tribal IDs don't meet the requirements. It would put sensitive data into DHS's hands. It includes information about where applicants registered, public assistance agency, their party affiliation, and once the government has that data, they could use it to target perceived political opponents, ask states to conduct voter purges. There's no telling where that data could go once it's been exposed. And finally, the burdens on election workers, it would obviously burden election workers, but I also want to point to the resulting impact of those burdens on election workers. If election workers know that they could be subject to 5 years in prison for doing their job, a lot of people are probably just not going to do the job. And that would add to the severe understaffing that a lot of jurisdictions are already facing, the reasons that we see polls opening late, the reasons that there are long lines. So the snowballing effects of those provisions could be quite serious. And I will pass it to Jonathan for what comes next.
Thank you, Nicole. So as I hope has been made clear, these provisions in the Save America Act and the Mega Act would be a radical departure from the way that elections are conducted in every state and the District of Columbia. And so, I understand why people are very concerned about how these might affect elections in your state, in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. But I have, some good news. Although either Save America or Mega would be, without question, the most restrictive election legislation ever passed by the United States Congress, it does not at this point appear like either has a path to passage. So election legislation, like many different kinds of legislation in Congress, is subject to the legislative filibuster in the Senate, which means that 60 votes are required on the Senate side to overcome a filibuster. At this point, neither Save America nor Mega hasn't even passed the House. Save America has. But neither has a path to passage in the Senate. In fact, the SAVE Act has bipartisan opposition in the Senate at the moment. All 47 Democratic senators, as well as Senators McConnell and Murkowski, oppose the SAVE Act. Senator Murkowski has talked about her concerns about how it would impact rural and tribal voters in Alaska. Senator McConnell has a kind of long-standing opposition to any federal election legislation. He has compared Save America to the Freedom to Vote Act, and his opposition is based on kind of the same grounds that he doesn't think the federal government should be involved. And for whatever the reasons, there is no path to 60 in the Senate for either of these bills at the moment. I know there's been some talk about changes to the filibuster rules. Senator Mike Lee, in particular, has been pushing for a move to a talking filibuster. Some change to the rules that would allow a bill to ultimately pass without having to hit that 60 vote threshold. But Senate Majority Leader Thune has said that there is not support in the Senate to change the filibuster rules at this time. And so that also appears to be off the table. And even a symbolic vote that would fail is unlikely until the DHS funding issues have been resolved. Senator Thune has said that the Senate will not vote on these bills until the DHS funding impasse has happened. So the prospects of any of these things actually getting through Congress are pretty slim. Of course, Congress is not the only federal actor we need to think about. I think not coincidentally, as soon as it became clear that there was no path to passage for the SAVE Act in Congress right now, we started seeing a lot of chatter about another executive order coming from the White House. The president has said that he will implement documentary proof of citizenship and voter ID before the midterms one way or another. And several of its allies, both inside and outside the administration, have been pushing the White House to issue an executive order doing just that. And in particular, I think especially in light of the past week's events in Iran and elsewhere, claiming that there is some sort of national security or national emergency power that the president could rely on to issue an executive order along those lines. But again, I think, good news for those of us who are concerned about these provisions. So the Constitution makes very, very clear that the only authority to regulate federal elections lies first with the states and then with Congress. The Constitution gives the president and the executive branch absolutely no authority over anything related to election administration other than what Congress has explicitly authorized the executive branch to do, which is not much. There is no emergency statute, there is no emergency power, there is no national security rationale that would allow the president to nationalize elections, to take over election administration, to overwrite the election rules of, the states and the district. When he has tried to do things along those lines, like he did last year with his first executive order on voting, the courts have pretty quickly stepped in and blocked those orders from taking effect. So in March of 2025, the president issued his first executive order on voting, which tried to add a proof of citizenship requirement, much like the one in the SAVE Act, to the federal voter registration form, and also tried to eliminate the mail ballot grace period that some states have. And that executive order has been blocked by 3 separate federal courts so far. And so, we are pretty confident that if the president tried to take some kind of executive action to, put Save America or MEGA into effect without Congress's authorization, that it would similarly fail. Secretary Noem has said somewhat recently that because elections have been deemed critical infrastructure by the Department of Homeland Security, that also gives the executive branch the power to kind of take over and run elections. That is flatly untrue. There's lots of critical infrastructures designated by DHS, including the healthcare system, And I think everyone remembers during the COVID pandemic in 2020, the government did not nationalize the healthcare system. They didn't start running the day-to-day operations at hospitals or pharmaceutical companies. What the critical infrastructure designation does is unlocks additional financial and logistical support that the federal government can provide to these systems, including elections. But there is no power under any federal law or the Constitution that lets the federal government take over and run elections. Um, our team at Campaign Legal Center, along with lots of national legal partners in the democracy and elections space, are preparing for any potential action by the administration to attempt to implement these things without proper constitutional and congressional authorization. And if they do so, we will be ready. Um, I don't want, so there's no reason to panic. Having said that, even if these efforts don't succeed, these sorts of bills in Congress, this sort of rhetoric from the White House is dangerous because it continues to perpetuate false narratives around the security of our elections. It continues to undermine people's faith in the democratic system. It depresses participation. And probably most importantly, it inspires copycat actions at the state and local level. So we're already seeing state legislatures across the country introduce their own versions of the SAVE Act, several of which have passed in the last year in states like Ohio and Louisiana. Arizona has had a version of documentary proof of citizenship requirements, although far less strict than the SAVE Act, now for almost 20 years, and it's caused 20 years of nonstop litigation and hugely costly implementation issues in Arizona. These sorts of bills, although they are not likely to take effect at the national level, certainly create risks of restrictive laws and policies modeled after them coming in at the state and local level as well.
Thank you. We're going to shift to Kadita and really dig into what this means for our communities. We're responding to some uh, questions in the chat or in the Q&A, most of which are sort of practical or logistical, sort of speaking to, I think, what people might be feeling about what might happen if this were to go into effect. So there's lots of questions about affidavits and name changes. It is required that states accept an affidavit, but the specificity around the implementation of that, the way that works at the state level, that is all left up to the states. There's a lot of uncertainty about what that would look like across all of the 50 states. We've got questions about provisional ballots and if you could cast a provisional ballots if you weren't in the poll book. For states that don't have same-day registration, like Pennsylvania, you would be given a provisional ballot and then they would look and see if you were eligible to vote. Are you registered? Were you in the right precinct? Right? Were all of the thresholds met to be able to vote? And if that's the case, then they would count your ballot. And if it wasn't the case, then they wouldn't. So those logistics would all fall to the states and ultimately to our county election workers. We tend to think that we have one presidential election or 50 state Senate races. Our elections are run by counties. We have 3,000 plus elections every time we have election day in this country. And so it's really important to know that lots of this is falling to the states and the counties. And so there's just a lot of uncertainty about how this would be implemented across the country. We will keep answering your questions as they come up. Kadita, take it away.
All right, thank you, Amy. All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me, League of Women Voters. I had the pleasure of giving a keynote for you all a few years back in Harrisburg. So thanks for having me here tonight. I'm gonna try to bring some energy here because I want to make sure two things are very clear. One is the Save America Act, the MEGA Act. They are not voter ID bills. They're voter suppression bills. That's period, right? And the other point I want to make very clear tonight is that the damage has already been done. Whether the bill ever passes or not, damage has already been done. So I want to thank Nicole, who went through a lot of the communities who will be most impacted and affected by the Save America Act, Mega Act, if it were to pass both chambers of Congress and then get signed into law by the President of the United States. So I want to draw your attention right now to one of those individuals who would have been most impacted. And many of you may know who this individual is. She's one of my favorite human beings to ever grace the planet. This is Miss Vivian Applewhite, pictured here in her late 80s. Late 80s. Miss Vivian Applewhite, and she was the lead litigant, right? So all great things can happen in your 80s. Lead litigant in a voting rights lawsuit, right? It was this is Vivian Applewhite versus the Commonwealth. Applewhite versus the Commonwealth, as it relates to a 2012 voter ID law, very similar to what the SAVE Act is. That was going to ask for very particular kinds of IDs, IDs that Miss Vivian Applewhite was not going to be able to provide. Many of you out there watching here tonight on a Wednesday night, you've probably seen things on your social media feed. Maybe you've had some conversations with loved ones. Maybe they're not so loved anymore after what's going on in the world. But maybe you've had some conversations with these folks and they're saying to you, what's the big deal with getting these IDs? You need these IDs to buy liquor at the liquor store. You need these IDs to write a check. You need these IDs to sign out a library book. These are the things we're hearing online. And this is why I talk about damage already being done. If you look at this picture of Miss Vivian Applewhite, pictured here in her 80s, you know that this is someone, as a Black woman born in the early 1900s, likely not born in a hospital. And when you're likely not born in a hospital, you're going to have a hard time getting a birth certificate, right? I also want you to look at Miss Vivian Applewhite here in her 80s. And remember that if she's going to the liquor store, nobody is carding her at the liquor store in her 80s. She's likely not writing checks at the grocery store because who does that anymore? And all the other reasons you may hear on social media about why are we saying it's so difficult? Why are we downplaying folks that can get this so easily? You heard Nicole talk about the cost of this, and this is why we say not only is this voter suppression, it's a poll tax as well. So on the next slide, you'll see a picture of Miss Vivian Applewhite and her success. Amy, on that next slide, you'll see her and her success here, and a picture here at 100th birthday, her 100th birthday, being victorious in defeating the 2012 voter ID law in Pennsylvania. And it's a reminder for all of us that just one person disenfranchised is one person too many. We know here in Pennsylvania, we've had elections won by 2 and 3 votes. And so 2 and 3 votes very much matter. And so it's a reminder to all of us, these are real human beings' lives who are impacted. Nicole listed off all types of communities who will be disenfranchised by this. And that's what I'm here tonight, is to make sure that we all fully understand just the real impact that this is going to have on real human beings, especially Pennsylvanians, who will not be able to ascertain a passport, because in these times, if I have $165 to my name, I'm spending it on my electricity bill and I'm spending it on food. I'm not going to spend it going to try to ascertain a passport for $165. The average American couldn't come up with $165 if you asked them to. And we already know how many people do not have a passport. And a birth certificate still costs money if you don't have it. If you need to get that reprinted with a raised seal, that's going to cost you some money too. And if I only have $20, I'm going to put food on the table for my kids. That's a decision that we're asking voters to make. And that's why we say that this is not just a voter ID bill, of which it is not. This is voter suppression. This is a poll tax. All right. So I get to talk about some real world barriers to this, and equity and access implications, right? And I want you to see some top line numbers. Last year, if you've ever heard me speak anywhere or seen anything I've ever written, you'll know that I used the number 1.5 million. Last year, 1.5 million Pennsylvanians were eligible to vote but not registered. Eligible to vote but not registered. The number just climbs. We can't organize our way out of this. We can't register enough people on the ground to get out of this predicament that we're in. The number is now greater. It's 1.65 million Pennsylvanians eligible to vote and not registered. Why does the number go up? It goes up because we have folks moving into Pennsylvania. We have young people turning 18. We have folks moving into Pennsylvania from New York and making our rent go up, baby, right? And so we have more people in this moment eligible to vote than probably ever before in the Commonwealth. That's a lot of people, 1.65 million. So if you'll see on the next slide, just who these people are. Again, I want you to, these aren't just percentages. These aren't just numbers. These are real human beings here in the Commonwealth. And if we look at who is not registered to vote and how this SAFE Act would impact voter registration. So let's not get that confused at all. This is really going to impact voter registration if it were to pass. And as I mentioned, damage has already been done about who's going to get registered to vote now because of it. We look at where the voter registration gaps are. And so if we look at just the bottom number of totals, we see that there are 16.6% of all Pennsylvanians eligible to vote but not registered. 17% Pennsylvanians all over. But the largest gaps exist in the communities in which organizations like my center, Black, Indigenous, other folks of color, you see where the voter registration gap is much larger. It's not 16.6 like the statewide average. It's 1 in 4 Black folks. It's 4 in 10 members of the Asian American Pacific Islander community. It's 4 in 10 of Latinos in Pennsylvania, eligible to vote but not registered. And as Nicole mentioned, all the communities that are going to be most impacted, these are those. And so already the registration gap is high. Imagine what's going to happen if the SAVE Act were to pass within these communities. Now, you'll see on the next slide that as an organization, we don't throw shade or shame at any individual who says that I don't want to get registered to vote, because Pennsylvania does not make it easy to do so. Pennsylvania is actually one of the harder states in the country to actually get registered to vote. We don't have same-day registration, like Amy mentioned. We don't have true early voting on machines. We don't have true automatic voter registration. We have a DMV opt-out system. And so it's not easy in Pennsylvania to get registered to vote. And if you think about what's going on in the current climate, so many people will say, I'm just not into politics. I don't want to get registered to vote. I don't want to vote. Or my vote doesn't count. I just don't believe that it's working for me. Or they'll say, I've been voting all these years and nothing is changing in my life. Or some will say, I'm formerly incarcerated and I didn't even know I had the right to vote in this moment. I didn't even know that was accessible to me anymore. And the fact that Pennsylvania is a closed primary state, in times in which we have folks that we're registering on the ground right now who don't want to belong to either major political party, these are also people who are already disenfranchised from the political process when they choose to be unaffiliated and not able to vote for candidates in primary elections in Pennsylvania. And we know that we're voting twice a year, every year. So I show you these objections that we hear on the ground because they're only going to be compounded by what's happening. I started off by saying the damage is already done. Here's how I know. We're on the ground every day. We've been out there since January 5th of the new year, in the snow and the rain and the cold, getting folks registered to vote. And what I know that it's a fact is that someone saw a news broadcast a few weeks back when the SAVE Act passed in the House, and they thought it became law. Because that's what they thought, right? Because not everybody watched, Schoolhouse Rock and knows how a bill becomes law. So somebody heard that on their news or saw it on their TikTok timeline and said, oh my goodness, what is this? I don't have a passport. I don't have a birth certificate. So I'm not even going to attempt to get registered to vote because I don't have these things that I just saw on the news or on my timeline said that I need. And they are not going to get registered to vote. That's already, bill passed or not, that's already happening. We are absolutely going to have people that are not going to go vote on May 19th. Because they're going to think that they need to show a passport or a birth certificate or some other ID they've been hearing about to actually go vote. That damage has already been done. There will already be votes suppressed. There will already be folks that will never come out and register to vote because of what they've heard and not fully understanding. And so you're going to hear more about the call to action from Amy. And I'm sure part of that is going to be we have to provide the civic education to our friends and our neighbors because they're hearing lots of information. They're catching bits and pieces of it, and it's going to cause damage to all of us here in the Commonwealth. The last thing I'll say is that this isn't anything new, right? We all know the phrase, if you don't learn from your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And so it's been almost 200 years of attempts to stop folks from actually casting ballots by raising fear about so-called fraud that is happening in order to suppress votes, particularly in certain communities, we might note as well. There's an article I want to have shared with you all tonight that comes out of Mother Jones. It's from a Harvard historian who talks about how even in early 19th century, there was attempts to suppress votes by talks of fraud that didn't exist. Pennsylvania is the originator, or one of the originators, if not the originator, of voter registration. Here in Pennsylvania in 1836, specifically in Philadelphia, the first voter registration law was passed, right? Voter registration was created to block folks from actually voting, not to help people vote. Voter registration in itself is voter suppression to make it very hard. Even in 1866 in New Jersey, they were passing laws to attempt people to stop from voting, claiming a fraud, such as making you go to your polling location on a Thursday to get checked in before you go vote the following Tuesday. Right? These are the types of laws that were passed throughout history here in our great country. And so it's very important for us to recognize that we are not experiencing voter fraud in this moment. This is not a thing that is happening in any meaningful way. This is strictly an attempt to suppress and disenfranchise people. The Save America Act, Mega Act, they are not voter ID bills. They're voter suppression bills, and we've got to push back on them. So thank you all for your time tonight.
Thank you, Khadija. That was great. There are a couple of questions coming in through the Q&A. Sort of as a reminder that even if you have a social security number or a driver's license or even a real ID, those do not qualify as proof of citizenship under these laws. Only 25% of real IDs across the country have proof of citizenship indicated on the face of the ID. And those don't qualify. So while it might seem sort of counterintuitive, that is what the law specifies.
And it's worth
Yeah,
mentioning too, Amy, that social
yeah,
security numbers, driver's licenses, things like that are made lawfully available to lawful permanent residents and certain categories of visa holders. So they wouldn't be a useful indicator of citizenship in the first place, which is why most of them don't indicate citizenship on their face, because
citizenship
they're
on them.
available to non-US citizens as well. But I think one thing that none of us have mentioned, that is important to remember is that we don't have a problem of widespread non-citizen voting in this country, for good reason. Number one, every voter registration form in America requires you to sign, to affirm under penalty of perjury that you meet all of the eligibility requirements to register and vote in that election, including US citizenship for federal elections. Lying on that form is a felony. And the penalties for registering or voting while ineligible are very severe, and include, everything from fines to prison time to, if you are not a US citizen, potential deportation, and inability to become a US citizen in the future. And so, the risk of, punishment is so severe that it's a pretty strong deterrent against ineligible individuals registering or casting ballots, just to cast one vote. It's, even if you were interested in stealing an election, that's not really an effective way to do it. And so, the system that we have works. And in most instances, when you see headlines or you hear about, a state identifying thousands of alleged non-citizens on the rolls, more often than not, what happens is the state is using outdated information and catching people who are naturalized citizens, who at some point were not US citizens and told the government agency that because it was true at the time, but then later became US citizens and registered and voted. And the state is now relying on old, out-of-date information to check its voter rolls. And so you'll see a splashy press release from an attorney general or a secretary of state saying those sorts of things. They found, 15,000 non-US citizens on the rolls. But then very quietly, it will turn out that almost all of those people are in fact US citizens. So the safeguards that we have in place work, and bills like these are just going to prevent eligible US citizens from exercising their constitutional right to vote.
That's right. And so in both cases, right, Khadija mentioning that voter fraud is not a problem and non-citizen voting is not a problem. These don't happen in any real or meaningful way, are really important to hold. I'm going to close this out by talking about what we can do. And I want to thank Khadija for showing us, for providing an example of all of the sort of best practices for when we do this work. So we're going to cover a few of like 4 buckets of work that you can do on your own, with your friends, with your family, in your community. And this is really designed to get you out there and getting engaged. We know that when people feel overwhelmed or despondent or hopeless or worried, the best way to combat that is through service, is through action, and it's to do it in community, right? And so that's what these calls to action are to do. And I would also add that it is true that the SAVE Act has fallen down on the agenda for a floor vote, and that's also because thousands and thousands of calls are coming into the Senate, right? We are not letting up on this, and it's really important. Those phone calls matter. So that is the very first thing we're going to talk about. Direct contact with your member of Congress, calling the district office, not just the DC office, is really powerful. Attend town halls, write constituent letters. And as Khadija showed us, personal stories about barriers matter. Those are the things that get your elected officials to pay attention. Referencing those local consequences, highlighting a connection you have with those local consequences, and then making a specific ask, right? So direct contact and then making it personal and help them understand the real life consequences that these decisions are making. Working in community to organize local pressure. So you can submit op-eds or letters to the editor to local papers. You can have a party and do it with your friends or your family. You can plan a community forum at your house of faith, in your neighborhood, at your neighborhood association, or encourage civic organizations like ours to write letters and advocate. The League gets emails all the time asking what we're doing about issues. And they're good questions sometimes. And I come back to my staff and say, like, we got to think about this. We need to respond to this email. What are we doing? And so either on your own or in community, there's ways that you can engage in this direct pressure strategy to make your preference heard. And we know this works because offices track calls and emails. We know that constituents receive priority over national campaigns, so it's really important that you're a constituent of the person that you're calling. And it's really important that it's personalized. I know that it's easy to sort of sign on to, 1,000-person letters, but the individual communication really matters, and we know that they count it, and we know it works. And we also know that research tells us that local media coverage influences congressional offices more than national attention. So it's this bottom-up pressure, right? We have to imagine that there's sort of multi-prongs out there, and this individual direct action, direct contact, and direct organizing, even if you don't imagine yourself as an organizer, is really effective. And it's really powerful.
And if you don't mind me just jumping in really quickly, because I
Yeah.
was I was inside Congress the first time the SAVE Act passed 2 years ago. And I really just want to emphasize what Amy said. I watched votes flip because of the impact that members were hearing about on their constituents. So like it really, really, really does make a difference.
Yeah. Local voices, real experiences, it really matters. Um, The next thing you can do, which is sort of obvious coming from the League of Women Voters, is to be active and regular in civic engagement. Engaging in politics is like a muscle. We have to exercise it. And different states vote at on different cycles. In Pennsylvania, we vote about every 6 months. And so it's really important to find trusted sources that help you stay on top of information. We know that this is not everyone's job, right? It is our job to stay on top of this information. And we know that you've got kids and jobs and lives and movies to watch and Netflix shows. And that's really important work to do too. And so find your trusted source of nonpartisan information that you know you can go to. Um, Make sure you vote every chance you can. And then talk to your friends, right? Become the trusted messenger for your friend. Um, and help your friends and family make a plan to vote and bring them with you when you're doing stuff, right? Um, we know from, again, research, I'm a political scientist by training. We know from research that when people make a plan to vote, they are more likely to vote. And it has to be kind of specific. Where are you going to vote? When are you going to vote? How are you going to get there? If you've got to deal with your kids, are they coming with you or is your mom going to pick them up, right? Really being specific about that plan makes folks much more likely to turn out to the polls. And bringing your friends and family and encouraging them to make the same kinds of plan is really effective. It is also important to know that the number one thing that gets people to the polls is being asked. And it can be asked by a campaign, it can be asked by an organization. But the most important thing is that the person being asked to vote trusts the other person. And if you are a trusted messenger in your community, like I said, in your neighborhood or your faith community or your friend group or your family, um, be that person. Ask them to vote. Um, Ask them to just tell them your plan, right? That's really powerful, and makes a real difference. Also, sort of, I want to lift up and amplify what Khadija said about the narrative. There is so much mis and disinformation out there on social media, um, I don't know, everywhere, frankly. And so, as the trusted messenger in your network or in your community or among your friends and family, again, find those trusted sources and share them. Use clear facts. And as Kadita also said, avoid shaming, right? Shaming doesn't help anybody. Um, and then participate in organized advocacy campaigns. So this could be support coordinated calling days. So some organizations ask folks to on a particular day, on a particular time, everybody call your senators about the Save America Act. You are helping shape the narrative for those senators who are being told that this is a voter ID bill when it is not, right? And you can help shape that narrative. You can help shape that among your friends. You can help shape it among local media with an op-ed or a letter to the editor, and you can help shape it among lawmakers by making those calls. Boosting social media campaigns, right? And we know that this works because research tells us that people process information through identity protection, which means they need to feel safe, so they need to trust you. And also, they need to feel validated. So even if you think what they're saying to you is crazy, or you know what they're saying to you is crazy, leading with shame or mockery is not effective, right? Instead, you find a shared value, right? And you lead from there. Yes, we all want safe and secure elections. I do too. Let's figure out how to get there, right? And you work on sharing that credible information so they're less susceptible to the mis and disinformation that they hear. There's a quote that I like that says, "Shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we are capable of change." Right? And so if we lead in any political conversation with any kind of dismissiveness, we're only going to foster defensiveness, right? And so sharing credible sources, leading with facts, leading with shared values, leading with shared fate, and then bringing that good information to the forefront is a really powerful way to help shape the narrative. And then last, because we are very much running out of time, we can support as normal, typical citizens. We can support policy making and election administration and legal strategies. So we can participate in rulemaking and public comments when laws get passed. So when the Save America Act gets passed, there should be, however brief, a rulemaking period that the agencies that are to implement it ask for feedback on rules, and you can write in and tell them what you think of how they should implement these rules. If you have any, again, personal experience, professional expertise, anything you can bring to bear on that process, public citizens are welcome to do so. We have a very accessible government if we choose to use it. I really encourage folks to support our election administration. We've talked a lot about the burden put on our election workers. In Pennsylvania, we're the fifth most populous state, and we have one of the smallest election staffs in the country. This law will only, it will overburden an already overburdened staff, right? So the way that we can support election administration is attending board of election meetings and making public comment and advocating for those election workers who are just trying to do their job and are now facing criminal charges and extra work. Volunteer, be a poll worker. We have 9,000 precincts in the state of Pennsylvania alone, and we need 5 volunteers every 6 months on election day. That's 45,000 volunteers we need every 6 months to run our elections. Volunteer. And then you can support litigation and legal advocacy by supporting organizations that engage in this, and more importantly, document your personal stories. If you encounter a problem at the polls, call one of the organizations you see on this webinar. Let us know, write it down. We know that legal strategies and advocacy work best when they're paired with that public mobilization piece. And this work just could not be more important at this time. We are 1 minute over time, and so I very much rushed through that. I did have a lightning round of questions, which maybe I'll ask one of them. I'm going to ask each of you in about 30 seconds to tell me what you think the most effective political action is for folks to take regarding protecting voting rights right now. And I'm going to start with Kadita.
Uh, It's to do the third thing, right? You got registered to vote. You went out and cast a ballot. Now it's holding elected officials accountable for promises they make us. That's the most effective thing you can do. A groundswell of public opinion is 3 of you showing up into a legislator's office on the same day, talking about the same subject, and they have to do something about it. That's the way that we get through this. And the last thing I'll say is make sure you're having conversations again with people in your neighborhood, in your community, and tell them what the IDs are that are acceptable right now, because they may not even know that you can get away with a utility bill, right? To actually show ID at the polls the first time you're voting or first time in a new precinct. So those 2 things.
Thank you. Nicole.
Sorry, I tried to unmute and it didn't work. I think Khadija just kind of said it, but I think talk to your community, call people in, be a listener. Don't be judgmental. Don't, if someone's not registered to vote, help them. Let them know when random elections are happening. There's someone in my neighborhood that does that, and I'm a voting rights attorney, and sometimes I'm caught off guard. So, I think just being a good neighbor and being a good community member and helping keep people educated.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Yeah, I'll go broad and I'll just say show up. Whatever showing up looks like for you, for each person, it's going to look different. In each community, it's going to look different. Showing up for you may just mean, making sure that you make a plan and going to vote. But it may also mean, being the person who goes to your county board of elections meeting to see what they're talking about and who voices, your opinion about what's happening in your community, and making sure you have a polling place that's accessible for the folks in your neighborhood. I remember when I was a kid, and I became old enough to register and vote. Voting was really important to my parents. And my parents telling me that, decisions are made by the people who show up. And if you don't show up, somebody else will, and then they're going to be making decisions that affect you. So if you want to have a voice in the decisions that are impacting your life, your schools, your roads, your grocery prices, you got to show up.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you all. I say to folks all the time, we don't all have to do everything, but we all have to do something, right? And that's showing up. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. We are going to send the recording, a number of resources that you can consult and share, and be that trusted person in your community. And slides, I think slides as well. I think everybody's okay with that. So we will send a follow-up to everybody registered, and then you will be able to find this recording on our various websites and YouTube channels and those sorts of things. Always reach out. I think any one of our organizations would take any questions if you have any questions. And thank you all for attending this evening.